Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining today's MLC Masterclass as a part of our Future of Manufacturing project, From Data to Decisions, Unlocking the Strategic Power of Industrial Data. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. We have all participant lines muted to maintain sound quality throughout the sessions, but we do encourage you to ask questions by placing them in the chat or the question box at any time. You can send them to particular panelists or to the entire group. We will do our best to address all of your questions either during the session or during the Q&A portion of this event. And lastly, this session is going to be recorded and will be sent out via email within 48 hours of the session's conclusion. And it will be available on the Manufacturing Leadership Council's website within about 5 to 7 business days. And now, please welcome MLC's Senior Director, Steve Moskowitz.
All righty. Howdy, everyone. Thank you, Lauren, and welcome to today's call. A little bit about the Future of Manufacturing project before we kick off today. In the spring of 2021, the Manufacturing Leadership Council, a division of the National Association of Manufacturers, launched the Future of Manufacturing project, originally known as Manufacturing 2030. The project's main goal is to enable manufacturers to envision what manufacturing might look like in the future, thinking, not just 5 years, but 10, 15, 20 years in the future. Realizing this goal requires thinking broadly about the context in which manufacturing will operate in the decades ahead, including population, demographic, socio-economic trends that will shape the industry. In addition, it requires us to understand the direction and velocity of technological trends associated with Manufacturing 4.0, the industry's transition to the digital model of manufacturing. Perhaps most importantly, it also requires us to identify and understand the challenges that we all will face as the industry moves to this next stage of Manufacturing 4.0. Armed with these understandings, manufacturers can better plan their longer-term future and find ways to enhance their value, competitiveness, and contribution to society. And with that, let's kick off today's session. Today, we're going to build off of what we've talked about over the last year, starting in December, with AI-centric factors of the future. AI is critical, but it also means that data is critical. Today, we're going to talk about From Data to Decisions, Unlocking the Strategic Power of Industrial Data. So AI alone is not sufficient. How do we really get the value of the data? Joining us will be our expert panel from Calypso, a Rockwell automation business. We have Stefan Burtsis, Consulting and Capability Lead, Jeffrey Miller, Industry Lead Principal for Federal, Aerospace, Defense, Semiconductor, and High Tech, and Sachin Misra, the Global Field CTO, all part of Calypso, a Rockwell automation business. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us, and maybe spend a moment to introduce yourself. Stefan, let's start with you.
Sure. Hello, everybody, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. So I'm Stefan Burtsis. I lead our global consulting capability at Calypso, a Rockwell automation business. And so my team and myself, what we typically do is help clients transform the way that they operate in their across R&D and manufacturing distribution operations to really become more autonomous and intelligent in the way that they operate every day. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Great, thanks. Jeff.
Thanks, Steve. Jeff Miller. As Steven said, I basically am an industry principal, and I keep my focus and these topics that we're talking about today across that portfolio of industries characterized by highly engineered products, complex processes. I spend most of my life at the nexus of IT, OT, digital product threads, digital process threads, seeking to optimize those things using the technologies and processes we're here to talk about today to drive value in these industries. Pleasure to have the chance to speak with you. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. And Sachin.
Hello, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm happy to be on this panel. I'm Sachin Misra. I'm the Global Field CTO for the digital business at Rockwell. And I work extensively with Jeff and Stefan and others to bring solutions to life. And that usually includes a combination of defining the enterprise architecture in a very heterogeneous environment, being able to integrate those solutions together to drive those data-driven insights, and in a lot of cases also help our clients develop and adopt bespoke solutions that work well with their existing environment. So I'm here to share some insights on how to bring those data-driven insights to life with technology. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, looking forward to the conversation. As a reminder to all of our participants, if you have questions, you can ask them either in the chat or the Q&A box. We'll try to bring them in throughout the session and have time at the end as well. So don't hesitate to share your thoughts and ask your questions. So let's kind of dive into this. We talked about from data to decisions. How do you unlock the strategic power of industrial data? So let's start with question one, which is why aren't we doing it, right? What are organizations really struggling with today when it comes to using their data to make better decisions, right? Why do we have to unlock it? Why can't we just do it today? So Stefan, let's start with you to kind of dive into this.
Sure. Well, thanks, Steve. I mean, I think, to me, it feels like the world has changed overnight in some ways, right? But the way that we use data in manufacturing operations really hasn't. I think we are living in an AI first world now. Just this past week, I have an example, right? My dishwasher died or it got clogged up, and before I looked through the instruction manual or Googled it or called, a service technician, the first thing I did was actually I went to ChatGPT and said, "Hey, can you walk me through how to troubleshoot what's going on with my dishwasher?" And instantly, I literally had a conversation with it. It walked me through step by step, do step one, then do step two. And I found out that it was just my drain was clogged within the dishwasher. And it said, "Here's how you clean that out." And guess what? My dishwasher works. I didn't have to go through an instruction manual. I didn't have to go and call a repairman. And I think why it made me think, why aren't we doing that in manufacturing, right? Why isn't that the reality? And I think the operators on the plant floor, they don't want to go through 20 reports, right, to understand what's happening with their operations. They want one clear, real-time answer of what happened and what should I do about it. And I think that's the promise that I think the operators, the people in the manufacturing operations want or have been told, but in reality, they're not quite there yet. And maybe one of the problems is what I call report proliferation. Not that reports are bad, but that's just the solution that we've had in the past, right? So we've had, all these dashboards and reports that kind of says what's going on, but not necessarily what to go do about it. So I think ironically, the more reports that we generate, the less clarity we actually get. And it's just more data, or I'm sorry, more data and more noise, but not really true insights or kind of recommendations on kind of what to do. So, on top of that, I think we have a lot of data challenges. I think our data in manufacturing operations is oftentimes a mess. And I think we have a slide that talks about some of the data challenges, but data is typically locked in OT and in IT systems, and you need both of those to be able to come up with recommendations or truly understand what's happening and become more prescriptive in terms of what to do next. And there's a lot of different inconsistencies around our data. There are different standards across the different OEM equipment manufacturers that are in our manufacturing facilities. There's differences in terms of the way that we tag data or the way that we name data across our lines, across our sites, and even across our functions. There's inherent differences between OT data and IT data in terms of how it's structured and how it's managed and stored. And that really becomes a challenge to be able to unlock the insights and the prescription of what to go do. So oftentimes we're stuck kind of forced with relying on a few specialists that understand OT data. So even if we wanted to act fast, we kind of have to wait on maybe an expert in that data to interpret what that data means for us to make those decisions. So, it's not just a data problem. It's not just a tech problem. I think it's actually a cultural problem. We have to holistically look at the tools, the architectures, and probably most importantly, our mindsets in terms of, how do we unlock the value of our data?
So before we go on, one question that kind of popped in my head as you were talking through is we often look at the challenge of legacy systems versus maybe a greenfield factory. Do you see this data challenge existing even if you're starting from scratch? Or is this something that if you're going to build a brand new factory, you're going to kind of engineer it out? Or is this something that, as you said, is just endemic in how we think about things today?
Yeah. I think from a brownfield perspective, it's very common, right? Or even or cross, companies that grow through acquisitions and they have different data standards across the different sites or facilities that they've acquired. And so that's definitely a major challenge. When we think greenfield, we don't want to replicate the sins of our past. And so, when we advise our clients on greenfield, it's really getting clear around what is that data model that you want to set up from the start with that greenfield so you don't, proliferate the data, have non-common data standards and languages across those different sites or that site as you're building it.
Gotcha. Good point. Thanks.
Those are really
Jeff
challenging.
Versation, anything to add here in terms of kind of what's causing this gap beyond what Stefan has already shared?
Yeah, I was going
Yeah,
to go ahead, Sage. Sorry.
sure. Well, I think, Stefan touched upon this a little bit, right? If you look at brownfields, it's really a heterogeneous mix of different technologies, different vendors, different OEMs that have all contributed to, how that facility operates and how it manufactures product. So it's kind of inherent in brownfields that you're going to deal with a lot of different disparate data sets in a lot of different formats, whether you're talking about master data from your IT systems, transactional data that's generated against that master data, time series data that's being generated on the shop floor, which may have different protocols in terms of how they communicate that out. So certainly from a brownfield perspective, it's challenging in the sense that you have to have a unification strategy. How do you bring them together? But not necessarily across the board. They have to serve meaningful use cases that provide those data-driven insights at the right time, in the right context, to the right persona. From a greenfield perspective, I think the challenge is a little different, but not radically different in the sense that even if you build a new facility today, likely you're going to work with multiple OEMs that have specialization in terms of specific machines. You're going to be working with EPCs that are actually integrating those systems together. But generally, where we find the weak point is the ability to stitch together all those data elements into something meaningful. So I think you have to be very purposeful, you have to be very deliberate. You have to work with that partner and OEM ecosystem to have a data first strategy that then translates into into technology that would enable that. So I think they're they have slightly different challenges, but you really have to be very deliberate and thoughtful. And to Stefan's earlier point, it has to be driven from a cultural perspective. And I think that's the key unlock is, define and promote a data-driven culture, and then you can translate that into, technology investments.
So Jeff, let's kind of build off of that and kind of get to the next question, which is we know the gap exists, right? For even in greenfield and brownfield, right? It's there for a variety of reasons. How do we close it, right? What are some of the things we need to do both at a foundational level and broader to start closing this gap?
But both Stefan and Sachin have mentioned a lot of the issues and things that have to be addressed. So the question becomes, how do you prioritize those activities that they're common sense? Some of them are a little more nuanced. You heard that from both Stefan and Sachin. Let me try to answer by a couple of examples, a so-called brownfield example and a greenfield example. We know in a brownfield setting, when we implement new technology, a new control layer technology, that we can acquire new forms of data, maybe gain more insights. But what we're constrained by is the fact that the data from previous machine configurations will be coded differently. The reason codes coming off of tags, the event codes, they'll be difficult to reconcile. We're doing work with one of the world's largest tire manufacturers to make those adjustments. And they went through a process, a business evaluation of asking, should we bring in industrial engineers open up the ladder logic at the PLC level. Now I'm at level 1 and 2 of the ISA 95 stack, and rewrite that for consistency? Or rather, should we create coding and programs that help to harmonize those data so that we can gain those insights? That's a case-by-case business decision that has to be made. But that's one that I think you hear Sachin refer to, and he'll, I think, may talk a little bit more about that later on in terms of the tech stacks. So we have to figure out, what cases are we trying to solve for? What are the utilizations of data that are most important to us? And as we migrate and move technology forward, do we basically retrench what we already have and reformat those, or do we leave them be? And we find this a lot in brownfields. Greenfields are easier. We've got several projects underway right now where the open-ended question is, what do you want that digital information thread to look like from a process standpoint, from the product design standpoint, and how they integrate? It's easier to configure those solutions and to build those unified namespaces and those data models and graph data models, the architectures, if you have a greenfield. We deal in both settings with some consistency. The common thread for both, and I'll leave it at this point, is identify the best ways to monetize the data. And I think you heard that from both Stefan and from Sachin, a little bit between the lines. At the end of the day, optimizing how you use industrial data comes down to the fastest and most efficient ways to monetize it beyond what you were using it for, basically out of the box, so to speak, to run a machine tool, to interface with your MES. What else can we do with those data? And this, again, as I said when I introduced myself, I spent a lot of time at this nexus of IT and OT, generally trying to help customers figure out what's the best path to monetizing those data. That influences the steps you take to close the gap.
So let's stay on the monetize for a second before I ask Stefan and Sensation to come in. You talked about monetizing, but some of the things you described, such as unified namespace, are foundational investments. They're hard to monetize the value of a unified namespace. So where do you start building kind of foundational elements that maybe are difficult to monetize versus jumping right to the monetization? Which one happens first as companies go forward?
I think the answer is often found in what problem is the most critical one they're seeking to solve. In the case of a tire manufacturer, it was integrating the material flow throughout the plant to minimize buffers. In the case of a greenfield we're working for with the U.S. government in depots, military depots, it's about capacity utilization and being able to achieve a maximum throughput in a depot that's servicing, for example, wheeled vehicles or radar systems. So we begin with the use case, and that generally drives us to which area we'll work in first and build the unified namespace model or the integration model. This is about establishing a new level of fluidity of movement of data. And without getting too academic, we all are familiar with the ISA 95 stack, the so-called Purdue model from many decades ago. And the paradigm behind that model, if we remember, was that there were distinct layers, the physical layer, the control layer, SCADA, the MES or MOM layer, and so on up to the enterprise layer. And the mental model was that it was a lot of work and effort to interface these to make data move. I think today the opposite is the case. Data is able to be moved with great fluidity up and down those levels. I think Sachin will talk more about this too. And so starting with a use case that says, I'm going to take data from one of the lower levels, I'm going to contextualize it with data from an upper level that historically has been hard to do. And it doesn't matter to me which problem I'm trying to solve here. It could be scheduling, could be material, but that's where you begin. Because as we all know in any project management, start with something that's meaningful, problematic, and will get positive press, if you will.
Gotcha. All right, excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that. Stefan or Station, anything to add to what Jeff has shared in terms of, how do we start to close this gap?
I think I just reiterate the point that Jeff made around, how do you monetize? Well, you got to define the use cases first, right? There's a lot of data in an operation. You can't necessarily unify all of it all at once. So really getting clear on what are those use cases that are most valuable for an operation or for an organization, defining those first, and then thinking about all of the pieces of data, the data requirements, elements around that, the architecture that is needed, right, to then be able to support a meaningful use case, which then think of that almost as like a data product, right? In terms of how that product is now adding value to the organization to be able to achieve whatever that use case is, whether it's, better maintenance, whether it's better operation, better efficiency, whatever that might look like.
All right, so moving on, right? So we now have our data structure as Jeff was talking about. We need to start thinking about AI. We're starting to put the data together. One of the things that we've talked before is AI. We tend to think of it on the end, right? We have the data, we're going to now leverage it. Are we able to actually use AI earlier in the process? So Jeff, as you were talking about, to start to contextualize the data. So what role does AI have early in the process and then also later in the process to generate value? So how should companies start thinking about it?
It's so important, Stephen. I'm really pleased that we're talking about this in this forum because um, it's so important to define properly what artificial intelligence and machine learning really are. And it's sometimes they're much different than what you'll read in the mass media or hear on television on the news. Um, in a way, we've been using data for AI-like purposes for some time. One need look no farther than closed loop process optimization. Now, that's not AI. We're not applying learning engines, but the manner in which we're using data to control processes with a new level of autonomy or automation is a first step. So often when we have customers that want to apply true artificial intelligence, heuristic learning, generative learning models to improve a process or to learn from various forms of data, we begin by looking at, well, have you done closed loop process optimization anywhere? Have you put in PID loops? Have you done model predictive control, the next sort of step, if you will, along one perspective, a journey of movement into AI? So we find often the best place to start is with a customer or client, a process client, for example, that has successfully implemented either fundamental closed loop process optimization or a more advanced model where they can ingest many more parameters, learn from results, look for and anticipate process excursions and take preemptive action, model predictive control. And that sets a good foundation for then establishing the new additional data required to build true AI. We have a project with a semiconductor company, and we hope to find it portable to other semiconductor companies, where we're building a chiller optimization program using a set of products that are geared towards building AI engines. And the issue here is this particular semiconductor company in this particular foundry spends about $90 million a year on electrical energy to dispatch chiller capacity, process water, chilled air, equipment, heat removal, and the like. And they believe they can achieve, and we agree, about a 5% improvement or reduction in energy consumption. Well, that $4.5 to $5 million reduction in the annual electric bill is worth the trip, simply by looking at a myriad of different parameters, understanding the interactions between electromechanical chillers, compressors, environment, demand in the actual clean rooms and fabs, bringing all that together, looking at the data, understanding how the system reacts when certain parameters are set, and learning from that, and then over time, building a system that operates with a level of autonomy using artificial intelligence in operations better than a human could at a console. So that's an example of the kind of progression I think minimizes risk of this new technology and new capability, but builds upon successes that, while they may not be AI in the literal sense, they do represent a level of sort of hands-off control to which many in manufacturing are unaccustomed. Closed loop process control, model predictive control, introduction of more data to build rules and heuristics, and then generate a truly AI or ML-based application. That's the progression that I see happening fairly often. Stephen, I'm not hearing Stephen.
Help if I got off mute.
Ah.
Session, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think Jeff did a nice job of describing it. What I would add to that is, AI is a very overused term. There are many different flavors. many different types of AI, and most of them can be classified as machine learning algorithms. The true sense of AI with neural networks, very little of that has been applied in modern manufacturing. Not to say that it can't be, but that's the first thing I wanted to say, is that I think most of what you see in industrial manufacturing today are advanced machine learning algorithms. The second part of it is there's nothing magical in here, in the sense that most of the common algorithms that we say or see in practical use are really advanced statistical models, right? What has changed is the amount of compute that's available at a, let's say, reasonable level of cost and a reasonable level of speed and accuracy. That is the seismic shift that has happened in the last decade to decade and a half, because ultimately, when you look at data scientists are really statistics majors, and if they understand core statistical concepts, that is really where you start. And now, I don't want to trivialize it, because one of the key pieces of technology that has really elevated that conversation is the whole notion of large language models, right? And I think this is really where it has shifted the trajectory a little bit. And just to give you an example, I have a client, actually, Jeff helped me quite a bit on this with this client, where they really started with a focus on production performance management. So it's really looking at time loss waterfalls, understanding how to decompose alarm events, and so on, right? What a byproduct of that was a enormous amount of data that's being collected in a very structured fashion into a large, let's just say, knowledge repository. Because when you start collecting that data, what they realized was that if they captured what the operators or maintenance technicians or the CI teams did to fix the issue, that is something that could be very easily fed into a large language model. And now you could start having operators go in there and ask it for advice, much like Stefan's example of a dishwasher, right? That's pretty common knowledge that you can source from many, many sources. The same concept applies to an industrial environment where, as you're going through your CI processes, as you're fixing issues on assets and lines, if that data in terms of the remediation is captured in the same knowledge base, what you've now built is a powerful knowledge base that can be queried on demand to give you real answers, much like Stefan's description of how he fixed his dishwasher. This is what we're seeing as being, the seismic shift, is, the proliferation of data, which we used to, all rail against because it used to, consuming terabytes of storage, has now given us this, this ability to harness that data and derive meaningful insights. And to me, that is really the true definition of AI, is a large collective of information that can be used in the right context to solve real problems as they arise.
So that's a great way to look at it. I appreciate that perspective. Because one of the things we're talking about, right, is the future of manufacturing project. So as we look ahead towards the future, right, some of the examples we've heard so far are, how do we do what we already do, but do it better, do it faster? Part of what you're talking about, Sachin, is how do we do something different, right? How do we fundamentally do something different in the future than we do today? And that's, I think, one of the challenges. And back to what we talked about earlier with the kind of the foundational elements, in order to really build this new way to look at things and talk about this knowledge base you described, is building kind of that foundational data structure, the unified namespace, is that all still required to get there? And is it even more important to get to that future than it is to kind of answer today's problems?
It's a great question, and it's a question that gets asked quite often by our clients. I think the way to look at this is that, and I think Jeff alluded to this earlier, is that you're going to have site-to-site differences. It doesn't matter if you're both producing the same widget, the same product. the back end manufacturing process is something that grows organically, whether it's through acquisition, whether you've added machines and capabilities over time, and so on. But generally, what comes out of that, or what falls out of that, is a very heterogeneous environment with lots of different nomenclatures. In fact, Jeff and I had to solve for this at a pharma client where they invested quite heavily on a real-time analytics solution, worked beautifully on the first line, and they kind of high-fived each other and said, "Great, now let's go do this in the second line and third and the fourth and fifth, and let's take it to the next site." Well, what happened was that analytics model wouldn't work on the next line because all of the master data tags are different. All of the controls are different. So this is where UNS becomes pretty powerful. And we kind of delineate it by, two layers. One is what we call site UNS, and then the other is what we call enterprise UNS. Generally, we advise our clients to start with site UNS because that harmonizes how that any underlying solution would work within that site across different asset types, different lines. Once you have that, and by the way, there's cultural aspects as well, because when they tried to take that UNS concept to the next site, they said, "Well, no, I don't necessarily agree with your concept of how you've defined flow rate or buffer and so on." So you have to start at the site level, get that to be successful, and then go create, use that as a baseline to go create the UNS model for the next site. It may be a little bit different, but that's okay because it serves that site's processes and the people and the culture within that site. Then what you can do is when you start having multiple sites that have kind of latched onto this notion of unifying the data elements within their site, you can abstract that to a secondary layer of enterprise UNS, where you can then map the esoteric differences between one site to the other to an enterprise layer. So UNS in that context can be quite powerful, but once again, you have to be very deliberate in the design. That I had a client that said, "Well, I'll just do it at the enterprise level and I'll just push it down." It was an abject failure because the site said it didn't meet the way they executed their processes, right? So you have to kind of think through it as a layer cake, right? And each layer serves its personas and constituents, and then you bring it all together.
So let's dive in there. And Lauren, if you could go to the next slide for a moment. As we think about that architecting that tech stack, I think this really is kind of where we're at now. Is as you think about this total tech stack, Jeff talked about it earlier. Is this no longer an enterprise level view? Is this, as you just talked through, is it a factory view that then connects to the enterprise? And how do we start to deconvolute this?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And, there's a reason why there's two primary colors on this slide, right? What it shows or tries to depict in a very simplistic view, there's a much more detailed version of this slide, but we kind of simplified it for this conversation. What you see in the red is what you typically find at a site level, right? So it's all the way from your level 0, up to your level 2, level 3. And generally and you can see that little kind of teal layer in between the green and the red, and that's kind of where the site UNS layer sits, right? So you're essentially serving the site's needs by unifying and rationalizing the data elements to drive data insights for that site's lines, that site's assets. And generally what you see above that is the enterprise layer, what we would call mostly level 4. Some would argue maybe MES is level 4, but we'll leave that conversation for a different day. So in the green is typically where you see the enterprise UNS layer, because that's generally where a lot of the master data, master IT data, and the transactional data sits. So when you put in that middle layer of site UNS, when you bring it up to the enterprise layer and you map that to an enterprise UNS layer, now you can define a single set of analytics that works across sites and serves the business owners that kind of live in that layer 4 space, right? So I think so we look at it as you got to have both. You have to unify it for the site so it serves that site's needs, and then map that to the enterprise, which is where, or corporate, whatever you want to call it, which is where a lot of the corporate decisions or enterprise decisions are made.
Contextualization is the key to successful industrial data management. There are others. I argue that contextualization is enabled by that dotted box, by that UNS or EUNS. You get that right, you remove a risk. Don't get it right, you introduce a big headwind to contextualization and to eventual value, I believe.
That's right.
And as you look at the unified namespace, is this a technology solution? Is this, as I think Stefan said earlier, a cultural solution? Where are the barriers and where are the challenges in getting this done correctly?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually at a client site right now, working on that challenge. I think it's a little bit of everything, right? First and foremost, you have to be sensitive to the culture within that site. Even if it's the same company, the way a company operates in Indianapolis is going to be slightly different in how it operates in Monza, Italy, for example, right? So first and foremost, you have to be sensitive to the culture, how they view data and data-driven insights, and help them understand that unifying or rationalizing those names across the site, across the lines, really is serving that specific site's needs, right? So generally, a plant will be, governed by a general manager, but you really kind of have to pay attention to that culture, and serve that site's cultural needs. I think the technology aspect is probably the last piece of the equation. Before you get to technology, what you have to be able to do is create what we call semantic data models, right? So this is going all the way from the level 4 systems down to level 0 at the physical machine layer, and understanding what use cases will unlock value, and then building a semantic data model that cuts across all of those layers. Then what you can do is you can immediately deliver value by taking that semantic data model and creating data products out of it. One of the biggest misconceptions is that you have to build the semantic data model end to end before you can generate value, which we always advise our clients not to do, because you're going to spend 3 years solving for something while delivering zero value, right? So what we always say is, be narrow in your definition, but go as deep as possible. Then rinse and repeat and add slivers, over time. That has worked, at numerous clients, and delivers value, usually within a quarter or so, because it's very tightly scoped and defined, and you generally will have, very passionate data product owners that are willing to go deep with you. What they're not willing to do is go very broad, because once again, a manufacturing culture or a site culture prevents that from happening. So that's a good way to remediate that approach, or that challenge, is define the use case, go narrow, go deep, build out the model, associate that to a data product, and then rinse and repeat that for other use cases.
And is this where what we're now calling data governance, right? Which is more than just, in the past, data governance was master data management in a high level. Is this now where data governance really needs to sit? Is at this level?
Actually, I would say that data governance needs to sit at multiple levels, right? I mean, this starts getting into the topic of, data mesh versus data fabric and so on. We'll save that topic for a different day. But at the very least, I think the governance needs to happen both at the site level, because you have generally an owner of that site, that can drive adoption of, let's say, standards that you apply for that site. So certainly site level governance, because you're going to add machines, you're going to replace controls. There's no manufacturing site sits still, right? There's always modernization happening or maintenance events and so on. So there's certainly a site level governance strategy, but you also need to tie that to an enterprise level strategy, right? So you kind of got to do both, to be able to get that value.
All right, excellent. So as we're kind of finishing up this section here, there's a lot to do. lot of opportunity. So what advice would you give to leaders who are now trying to establish this more robust data strategy, right? Centered around maybe the unified namespace, but they're feeling overwhelmed, especially if they're in a case where it's a brownfield, or if they're dealing with mergers and acquisitions, or just factory expansion. So that sense of overwhelmingness is huge. Where should they start, right? What's some advice you would give them, Station?
Yeah, I think there's a long answer and a short answer. I'll start with the short answer. I think one piece of advice is, I think you got to shift the focus from tools to integrated architectures, right? And I think this is a little bit of a mind shift, because historically people have gravitated towards point solutions that solve a very specific need without really paying much attention to the implications to the adjacent applications, or downstream usage, reuse of that data, and so on. So I think shift that focus. Think about kind of that architectural construct to serve those use cases, and these use cases need to be prioritized, because you may find 150 use cases that that people want to implement, but you have to start with understanding which ones will deliver the highest value to that site, or to the to the enterprise, and then decompose that into what the architecture is needed to support that particular use case. And I think many leaders get stuck in trying to modernize every piece of the legacy infrastructure and chase all these new technologies, which generally doesn't work very well. So instead, kind of step back and define this, what I would call a cohesive IT and OT architecture, to serve those handful of use cases that drive value. And that maps directly to prioritize business use cases, right? You can attach business value to it. And this structured layer approach that we talk about, the layer cake, if you will, of utilizing UNS to rationalize and so on, what it does is contextualizes your existing data assets. And this is key, right? Because what we don't want to do is create and proliferate more data. What we want to do is leverage data that we have. Maybe there's some new data you can add to it, but contextualize your existing data that everybody has in just some shape or fashion. And that's where you can start identifying the gaps, right? In terms of data availability, the data pipelines needed to serve those use cases. And this is where you start making the decisions on where do you standardize, where do you integrate, where do you simplify. And this clarity kind of reduces the noise that Stefan was talking about, and lets you invest a very focused effort where it delivers the most impact. So I think the key here is to move from what I would call isolated reactive fixes to more of a platform oriented mindset. And that doesn't mean that you got to implement the entire platform with every bell and whistle, but once again, centered around those use cases, and then anchor that strategy in reusability, scalability, interoperability. These are all things that will help build those slices that I talked about over time. And I think you also have to kind of be mindful of how the analytics need to be defined for the edge use cases. So what runs at the site level, what runs right next to the line, what's serving that operator that needs to be potentially real time or near real time, versus things that need to trickle up to the enterprise layer that are more depictive of performance over the last shift, or the last week, or the last n number of work orders, and so on, right? So I think instead of trying to solve for everything, I think if you take that approach, what you get is a framework of sustainable data management approaches, and a sustainable system that can grow and scale over time, right? So the idea is use what you have and bring it together into a more cohesive environment where they can actually generate meaningful data products and use cases.
Great. Appreciate that. Steph, let's go back to you on that in terms of what you've kind of heard from where you started to where we've ended. What advice would you give folks as they're going forward to make this reality?
Yeah, I think Sachin covered most of it, but it's like, again, get focused on what's important, number one. So if you don't have a strategy and a vision and like what's the most critical piece for your business, then you're kind of lost. Once you know that, determine the use cases that are going to, achieve that vision, right? And then it's about get really clear on, like Sachin said, the slices, right? So don't start wide, start narrow, but go really deep in terms of the data that's needed, putting in that semantic layer, right? Which I translate that into like a Rosetta Stone around like all the different data components in many different locations. So a human can interpret it, right? That will allow it to be more of a self-service model in terms of gaining insights, right? And the architectural pieces that Sachin mentioned to achieve those use cases, right? And then now you're delivering real value, right? So whether that's a maintenance use case or whether that's an efficiency use case or an energy use case, right? You are delivering the value that you need in probably a matter of a quarter, like Sachin said, and then you continue to build and scale that, right? So start with strategy, get focused on use cases, let the use cases lead the value, prove the value, and then kind of rinse and repeat on the next use case. That's second most important.
Listen, Jeff, we'll give you
No,
almost the final word.
Yeah, very little to add to my the excellent and thorough answers from my colleagues. Well, I've listened to both of them, and here's what I hear. It kind of floats across the top. It's less about picking the specific operation. Oh, let's go fix predictive maintenance. Oh, let's go fix machine changeover. It really matters less which specific operational area in which you focus. And what matters ultimately, much more, are the data availability, the use what you have, the proper construction, the creation of a winning case, so to speak, a winning demonstration. And this gets back to the very first thing we spoke about that Stefan raised, and that was culture. You need a success. And I find in my early conversations with customers, very often we come back to from something that they want to do that would be, it's intergalactic. They want to solve an enormous problem. And we go back and ask the basic question, do you have the connectivity you need? Are you acquiring the data that you need? Are you storing it in a way that's retrievable, particularly with time series, which Sachin touched on? And often we find the answers to those are no. So all three of us have said in one form or another, come back to the basics, select a meaningful use case, one that'll make a good commercial, a good advertisement when you show us success about the constructive use and monetization of industrial data. That demystifies this. And we've used a lot of big words and a lot of big concepts here, but it really, you get it down to that level. Go find a project that uses what you got, applies the principles you've heard from all three of us, and then wash, rinse, repeat, and you'll be successful.
Excellent. For folks on the call, any questions? We have a little bit of time. You could pop off mute. You could raise your hand. If not, I have a couple more, but I'll give the chance. No? All right, I want to go back to the culture question for a moment. You talked, Jeff, just about, culture was critical. Also, data readiness is critical. I just saw a hand go up and disappear, so I will get to you in a moment. So how do you balance the culture questions, right? Where does that start? Is it more important to focus on getting people willing to ask different questions and think about data differently? Or is it more important to start with getting the data readiness?
Yeah,
Right?
I'm reminded.
Where do you start there?
Sachin's referred to a customer with whom we've been working for several years now. And often with questions like this, I come back to a very pivotal first event, and Sachin will immediately know what we're talking about here. We found an evangelist for this analytics tool. We found an organization. They didn't call it continuous process improvement. They had some other name for it, but it was basically the CPI team. And the CPI team struggled with having enough data to make the case for an OpEx or a CapEx investment. And then we came on the scene with this set of tools, and they immediately became the evangelist because they could fast forward to the end value proposition, and they became such strong advocates. The leader of this organization, her team, and I think in hindsight now, and Sachin would be interested in your view here as well, I think that was a pivotal moment. You found a sponsor, an evangelist, somebody who was able to see to the end state use of the data in an application to drive value. It was a pure industrial data management model. And that was kind of the key to breaking through a cultural barrier. A strong advocate on the inside is a really critical thing.
Gotcha.
Sachin remembers
Great
what I'm
to hear.
talking about.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, and you've heard me use this in the past, but I'll use it again, Steve. This evangelist who was very, very passionate about you know, not necessarily serving the top floor, but really being a servant leader to the line side operator. So it was a very grassroots movement of identifying, the key players, the people that had the intrinsic knowledge of how the operations performed. When an asset went down, who are the people that can come fix it? And one of the terms that he used was, think of this as a Iron Man suit, right? The Iron Man suit brings a lot of advanced capabilities that is very contextually aware of the environment and can provide a lot of insights, but it's meaningless without the human inside, right? And that has stuck with me in the sense that I think if from a culture perspective, if you empower your customer, right? That could be a line side operator, could be a shift supervisor, could be the general manager of the plant, whoever it happens to be. I think you have to put yourself in their shoes. You have to be empathetic to what they deal with, and then how do you give them that Iron Man suit that is really, giving them visibility into the state of their operations, right? And that's the mindset that we go in with every engagement is who's our end client, what do they need to be successful in their role, and what data insights can we deliver to them in their day-to-day operational activities that makes it feel like an Iron Man suit for them, right? And I use that all the time because I think it's a very powerful analogy.
That's great. It's a great way to look at it. I think that role of that evangelist is vital. So in lieu of time, Stefan, you'll get the last word. Anything final that you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have anything new or additional to add. I mean, I think we covered most of it. I mean, again, just stress the importance of um, culture, and part of culture is organizational change and organizational change management, right? So the evangelist role is very important, but it's also making sure that we take a human-centered approach in terms of how we bring data and technology and the architecture to life to like what Sachin said, make it feel like an Iron Man suit, right? Is that it's not just a, hey, you got a new tool, go use it. It's a, let me understand how a operator, a supervisor, an executive, what are they trying to achieve in their day-to-day job? And now what does that mean in terms of how maybe behaviors have to change, tools definitely need to change. The governance that you mentioned is going to have to change around it as well. So it's a yeah, when people look at these solutions or try to monetize data and operations as a technology solution or creating another report, it fails every single time.
Yes, excellent point and excellent conversation. We appreciate your time. We have a few final slides that we'll show, and again, give a chance for anybody who has any final questions. Lauren, if you go to the final slides here, just real quick. We have some upcoming events. We just recently did a survey around shaping the AI-powered factory of the future. So a lot of the conversations today are going to be supported by what we've seen in the survey. That is May 21st at 2 p.m. We'll be doing a readout of that, and the article with the survey results will be published before that. So take a look. That's all coming soon. You can register at the QR code, and information will be sent via email as well. If you go, we have upcoming plant tours. United Scrap Metal is our next one in August in just outside of Chicago. Really looking at how they're driving sustainability improvements in manufacturing. Should be a great opportunity to see things in practice. And then finally, Rethink. Hey, there we go. Rethink, which is our keystone event of the year, is happening in June. There we go. Happening in June in Marco Island. It includes our gala awards for manufacturing and leadership awards. It's a great chance again to learn and see what's going on in terms of huge opportunities to learn from one another about today's challenges and how people are moving forward and to network. If you have any questions, you can see information here. But before we end, we do have one question in the chat. I'm going to open it up real quick. and I will read it out and leave it to the team to answer. As organizations look to establish a unified namespace and move toward real-time data-driven decision-making, where should they start? Is it the site level, as we talked about with specific use cases, or do you need to start at that enterprise level to build that enterprise platform, right? You don't, as Sachin, as you said, you don't have to build the platform, but you have to kind of know what the platform is going to look like. So where should companies start? Is it building that platform vision or building that factory solution?
I think you have to do a little bit of both, right? And this is my perspective, just based on how we've delivered solutions to our clients. What I would say is, don't just focus on building a platform without thinking through what use cases that platform is meant to enable, because that platform deployment will take you forever and you're not delivering value along the way, right? Conversely, I think doing site level use case enablement without thinking through of the broader platform implications, could come back to bite you. So you kind of have to do a little bit of both. It doesn't mean that you have to go 100% on the platform side, but you do have to pay attention to it. So generally, what we'll do with our clients is, go where the value is, go where the money sits, go enable that, and then pay attention to what the scalability of that solution should look like. So if you're implementing some solution at one line, at one site, think through, if that use case became wildly successful, how would you go implement it 100 times at 20 lines across 5 sites, right? So that's the answer. It's a little bit of both, right? I don't think you don't skew one way or the other. There's a good balance to be had there.
Yeah, that's a great way to end as well. Is we always talk about start small, but start small with the expectation of success, and thinking about scalability early is often important. We often get surprised when things are successful, and then we're like, what do we do now? So I really like that comment of assume success and what would it take to scale early, even if you're not going to necessarily scale right away. With that, again, thank you everybody for your time. Stefan, Jeff, Sachin, great talking to you all. Hopefully we'll see you in Florida or at other events. Everybody else on the call, have a great day, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you for having us, Steve.
Thanks all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.